Hello again, this is a chapter 12 video. We're going to have a look at exceptions and start to introduce them in this video. I'm going to give you first of all a brief demo of the total exception process and a very basic and simple idea just so you can see the whole process. Then we're going to look at the exception hierarchy to see what's going on a little bit more, and then we're going to look into the throwing and exception and understand what the throwing does. In later videos we're going to look more specifically at the try, catch and finally parts of the process. So first of all, let's have a quick look at a demo. So what I've done is I've created a test class. Let's have a look in this test class. And this test class is very straightforward indeed. All it does is has a single field of an array of type string called x, and then it's got a single method called show. What it does is if x is equal to null, so if the x array has not been created, then print out that error message, the array is empty. If it has been created, then try and search for that particular index. Again, we may need to do further error checking on the particular index, but this just checks to see if the array is empty. So that's basically it. Here we have the test demo of that, and that runs that there. So let's have a look at what happens. So as you'd expect, it returns the array is empty. So that's all well and good, but if it wasn't a user, for example myself, using this machine, and it was a client or another class using that, then that bit of information is not going to be very useful. So we need to use some kind of exceptions. Again, we could use some kind of boolean in this method where it returns false if it's unable to print out the array, but it doesn't really give that much information if it just returns true or false. So let's have a look as to what we can do. What we can do is start to bring in throwing an exception. So let's have a look at that. So what we can do, rather than using a system.out.println message, we can throw an illegal argument exception. So what this thing does here is if we use the throw keyword, we throw a particular exception. It's effectively creates an illegal argument exception, and Java then puts it out there. There's a bit of the illegal argument exception, as you'll see, takes in a parameter. You can put in a type string and then just give a particular piece of information back. So this is now creates an illegal argument exception. So let's have a look at what happens in our code now. Now at this point we get our error message. So I've got my specific error exception there, Chris exception, array is empty. So this gives us some fault diagnosis information which we might use in our code. So this is all well and good, but again, we haven't really solved the problem because the program is still crashing at that point. So how do we deal with that? Now, the way we deal with that is we use a try and catch keywords. Now, we're going to go into that later, and also for this particular example, I'm actually using an unchecked exception, so we don't need to do a try and catch for an unchecked exception. I'll explain that later on in the video, but it's good to sort of demonstrate what's going on here. So here's our test demo again. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to add in a try and catch. I'm going to pause the video and add it, and then go back to it. So this is the before shot, and this is the after shot. All I've done is added in this try keyword, inserted some braces, then the catch keyword, catching an exception, then the braces, and then the system.out.println, and then we're using the exception which is caught here, and putting that to string. Now I'm going to go into this in much better detail later. I just wanted to give you a view of what we're trying to achieve here. So that's what we've done there, and what we do is we try and do this, try and call that method, but then if it doesn't work, then we can do that. So then the program will be able to continue gracefully. So let's just try that now. So now the program has continued. I can now run some more methods on that object if I want to. There is no more other methods, and it does give this error message as well. So this now has solved the problem. Previously, if I tried to access that null array, the program would stop and there would be a problem. Now I've thrown an exception, I've caught that exception, and I've dealt with the aftermath of it. In this case, I've printed out an error message, but you don't have to print out that error message. You could give out some other information, but that's essentially what we're trying to do when we use a throw and try and catch. So let's get to this presentation, and let's just consider now the throwing principles. So again, rather than returning a boolean true or false, we can throw an exception to give more detail. This is a special language feature of Java, and there's no special return value needed like some kind of boolean. When we do throw an exception, the errors cannot be ignored in the client. They must deal with them in some way. We dealt with them with a try and catch, but they must deal with them in some way. And by throwing some kind of exception, the normal flow of control is interrupted. And then we need to use special recovery actions required. So this is our try and catch I just demonstrated there. Here is an example in our contact details and get details methods. What we're trying to do is we're trying to get details. So if the key is equal to null, then we're going to throw an illegal argument exception. So this is the same thing as we've just done in our example. And that's going to just take in a little error message there, which is null key and get details. Now we can use this in our fault diagnosis and just use a throw on its own. But again, once this is thrown, then at the moment the program will stop. It will need to be dealt with, and we'll look at that in a bit. So when you do throw an exception, there's a few things which you need. First of all, you need to use this throw keyword. The next thing you then is you create a new object type. Now the exception which we created was the null argument exception, but there's lots of exception types which we're going to look at in a second. You create that exception type and give it whatever parameter that object requires. When you are writing these exceptions as well and you're dealing with exceptions, then you're going to need to use the Java documentation. So if you do get your method to throw a specific exception, then you need to use the @throws in your Java documentation. So before we go any further, let's have a quick look at the exception class hierarchy. So that's how it basically looks. We're really interested in the right side of that, with our exceptions and our runtime exceptions. Now, I briefly mentioned unchecked exceptions, and unchecked exceptions are in the runtime exceptions, and the checked exceptions are in are part of the exceptions class. Now, what does that mean? Well, let's investigate that, because that is important to understand that. So we've got two kind of exceptions. We've got checked exceptions and we've got unchecked exceptions. Now, we have been dealing really with unchecked exceptions up till this point, and the demonstration I gave was an unchecked exception. So these type of exceptions the programmer should be able to deal with. You shouldn't have a problem with null pointer or illegal arguments, because the programmer should be able to code for that to check whether the index is actually in that array list or whatever it might be. This is not checked by the compiler, and it's a subclass of the runtime exception. So we've got some examples there of a null pointer exception and an illegal argument exception. These do not need to be tried and caught, so the compiler will compile without the try and catch for these. This is different to the checked exceptions. Now, checked exceptions are something we're going to come into more and more, especially when we connect to databases, try and save to files, and try and deal with a lot more input from the users. So if you use a checked exception, the programmer cannot check when he's writing his code. So if the database is not there, then he can't look into the future and see that. As I say, use for anticipating failures. And if a user puts in a database or a URL doesn't exist, then that's when they're needed. If you do use a checked exception, though, you do need to try and catch it. It will not compile without a try and catch around or using that checked exception. So the unchecked exceptions don't require trying and catching, where the checked exceptions do require catching. So that might explain what I mentioned earlier when I was talking about my unchecked exception, which was my illegal argument exception, which we created. So the effect of an exception. If you throw it, it will make the program or method finish prematurely, and it won't give any return value. The problem at this point then is control doesn't return to the client's point of call, and the class can't then deal with it. So the client cannot carry on regardless. You may catch that exception, and that is how to carry on regardless, and I showed you that briefly in the demonstration. So here is a couple of examples of argument checking using a throwing. So what we've done there in the get details, we throw an illegal argument exception, null key and get details, and then we throw another exception there, empty key passed to get details. So at the moment we've got some good fault diagnosis in there, so if we went through our program and tried to run it, rather than the program just ending and it not working, then we can specify whether it was whether the key wasn't there or whether there was some other problem with the key. Okay, so that's a good bit of fault diagnosis using throwing there. Another way we can do this is, so this is the actual creation of an object. So this is in the constructor itself. Previously we just used it so that if all of the objects in the parameter list there, or any of them were equal to null, then we just make it an empty string. However, what we're going to do now is, if the name or phone number is not blank, then that we're going to say is a bit of a problem. One of them must have something in it. So if that's the case, then we're going to throw an illegal state exception, and that's another special kind of exception there. So in order to get you used to throwing and exceptions, then I want you to do these exercises here. Once you've done that, then come back and have a look at the next video. We'll investigate trying and catching of those exceptions. See you then.